The delivery room froze the moment he said he would not sign the birth certificate for the child who had just been born. No shouting, no trembling, just a calm sentence, and everything collapsed. The man was Ethan Cole, 41 years old, built solid from years of outdoor labor, with deep, steady eyes that looked like they had learned to face storms head-on. He stood beside the small table, in a room at St. Mary Hospital in Denver, where the birth certificate had already been placed, the line marked father neatly typed with his name, the pen resting beside it, like an ending that had already been decided. But Ethan did not pick up the pen. Maddie, his wife, had just come through a long and exhausting labor, the baby cradled in her arms. Sweat still clung to her forehead. Her hair matted her face, pale with fatigue, yet her eyes remained sharp as they locked onto her husband. To the left of the bed stood Marla Jennings, Maddie's mother, a woman who had always known how to dominate a room the moment she stepped into it. On the right stood Diane Cole, Ethan's mother, a retired nurse, her back straight, her silence heavy, her gaze reading the room the way she once read vital signs. The hospital administrator spoke in the practiced tone of someone who had repeated the same sentence thousands of times. Just a signature, and we're done. Standard procedure. Ethan placed his hand flat on the table. His palm was warm, but his voice was cold. We wait for the DNA test. The words landed like a blade. Maddie tightened the blanket around the baby. Marla's mouth fell open, then anger rushed in to fill the gap. Diane said nothing, but her eyes shifted slightly. She understood the weight of this moment better than anyone else in the room. Ethan knew he was being underestimated. In their eyes, he was only the husband who was rarely home, a maintenance engineer for wind turbines, constantly moving between wind farms across Wyoming and Colorado. His job kept him climbing steel towers in freezing air, fixing systems that were never allowed to fail. His life was built on discipline, on precision, on timelines that had to make sense, and that was exactly why he could not pretend. Aurora, the quiet suburb outside Denver, had once been the place where Ethan believed he had built something solid. A 2-story house, a neatly trimmed lawn weekend barbecues in the backyard. Maddie worked an office job, spoke easily, laughed easily, always knew how to make people trust her. Ethan trusted her completely, until the numbers in his head stopped adding up. An all-knowing perspective saw the pieces fall into place, one by one. Team dinners that ran too late. Late-night calls Maddie answered in a lowered voice. Business trips that lined up too perfectly with Ethan's time away. And above all, the name Grant Holloway, the powerful boss Maddie mentioned more and more often, always with a tone that mixed admiration with something closer to fear. In this moment, all of it converged in Ethan's mind. He did not explode. He did not accuse. He chose the one thing that could not be twisted, the truth. Maddie watched as the man she believed had been worn down by life stood unmoved in the center of the room. Fear crept in, not because he raised his voice, but because he did not. Marla stepped forward, her voice sharp with outrage. "What are you doing, Ethan? This is your wife. This is your child." Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. "If the child is mine, science will say so. I am not refusing responsibility. I am refusing blindness." Only then did Diane speak, her voice low but firm. "Let the truth speak." The administrator stepped back, sensing that this moment had moved beyond paperwork. Maddie lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly. For a brief instant, too brief for anyone else to notice, her eyes flicked toward the door, as if searching for a way out. Ethan saw it. And he knew. This was not the day everything fell apart. This was the day the truth stopped pretending. He did not leave the hospital to the sound of shouting. He left in a silence heavier than any storm. The delivery room door closed behind Ethan Cole, sealing in a space thick with everything that had not been said. Maddie still held the baby, her back pressed into the pillows, her eyes red but dry. Marla stood frozen, her anger caught halfway up her throat. Diane followed her son into the hallway without asking a single question because she already knew what he was carrying inside. The hospital corridor felt long and cold. Fluorescent lights reflected off the tiled floor like thin blades. Ethan walked slowly, each step weighted with the house in Aurora, with the evenings he had once believed were peaceful. Outside, the Denver sky hung low and gray wind cutting through the parking lot like an unforgiving whisper. In his mind, timelines lined up neatly precise as a technical blueprint. Not because he was paranoid, but because he had been trained to see failure before a system collapsed. Ethan was the kind of man people underestimated. A maintenance engineer always climbing wind towers, jackets stained with grease rarely seen at polished social gatherings. But those who worked beside him knew the truth. He was the one who kept the entire network from going down. When the wind was strongest, when temperatures dropped the lowest, when everything was at risk of breaking, Ethan was the man they called. His work forced him to be away. Weeks at wind farms scattered across the harsh emptiness of Wyoming nights, sleeping inside metal containers, the sound of wind screaming as if trying to tear thought itself apart. Every time he returned home, he carried exhaustion, and with it the belief that in Aurora there was a woman waiting for him. Maddie used to say she admired his endurance. She had pressed her hand to his chest and told him she was proud. Ethan believed her. He believed her enough not to question it when she started coming home late. Enough not to doubt when her phone vibrated late at night and she stepped out onto the balcony to answer. But trust does not make numbers disappear. It only delays the moment you are forced to face them. From an all-knowing distance, the truth was already visible. Team dinners that ran too late. Business trips Maddie retold differently each time. The way she mentioned Grant Holloway with a tension that did not feel natural. Grant was not just a boss. He was the man who controlled project assignments, promotions, careers, the future of Maddie's work, with nothing more than a quiet nod. To Maddie, Grant was both an escape and a trap. She told herself it was only support, that she deserved attention, that Ethan was not present enough to understand her pressure. And step by step she crossed a line she once swore she never would. Ethan sat in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine still silent. He thought about the first moment doubt crept in. A rainy evening, Maddie coming home with the unfamiliar perfume on her coat. She laughed and said it came from a coworker. Ethan nodded, but his mind stored the detail quietly. He remembered his old friend Caleb, who once joked half seriously that men who were often away should trust science more than emotion. Back then, Ethan had laughed. Now the words rang clearer than ever. In the delivery room, Maddie had glanced toward the door. A reflex. She was looking for someone who was not there, someone who had promised her something beyond Ethan's reach. Diane had seen that look. Marla had not, or had chosen not to. Ethan turned the key. The engine came alive, steady and deep. He did not know what the test results would say, but he knew one thing. Whatever the truth was, he would not be forced to sign his life away on a lie. Elsewhere in the city, Grant Holloway sat inside his glass office, staring down at traffic below, believing everything was still under his control. He had no idea that a man had just walked out of a hospital, carrying the patience of steel and the power of truth, and once the final pieces locked into place, none of them would be able to turn back. The pregnancy news arrived like a blessing, and also like a blade wrapped in velvet. Ethan received it on a quiet afternoon when Maddie stood in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes shining a little too brightly, her voice soft, as if asking forgiveness for something that had not yet been discovered. She said it with a carefully practiced smile. "We are going to have a baby." The house in Aurora seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, warmth flooding his chest by pure instinct. The instinct of a husband who had waited for this moment for a long time. For a brief heartbeat, He allowed himself to believe that every doubt had been nothing more than exhaustion. From an all-knowing view, that happiness rose quickly, almost too quickly. Evenings filled with plans, lists of baby names, the empty room chosen to become the nursery. Maddie talked, more laughed more, as if excitement itself could seal every crack. Ethan fixed the windows, installed a nightlight, painted the walls a soft color. His hands worked with practiced ease, as if building something solid could repair everything else. But even inside that joy, small details surfaced. Maddie startled whenever her phone vibrated. She avoided Ethan's eyes when he asked about her work schedule, and the team dinners did not disappear, even as her belly became more visible. She called it responsibility urgent projects, her boss's trust. Grant Holloway. The name slipped from her lips far too easily. Ethan did not argue. He did not want to become a man driven by baseless suspicion, but he began to remember. Dates, times, words, the gap between what was said and what could be verified. It was not a bad habit. It was survival, the skill of someone whose job was to prevent systems from collapsing. One evening, as rain tapped against the roof with a cold counting rhythm, Maddie came home late. Her coat carried an unfamiliar perfume, sharp and heavy, nothing like anything she owned. Ethan asked gently. She answered too quickly. A co-worker. Her smile arrived early and left just as fast. From above, it was clear how tightly her fingers gripped her bag, as if holding on to a secret. In those days, Maddie convinced herself she was doing what was necessary. She told herself Grant was only helping, that she deserved attention, that Ethan was too far away, too busy, too steady to understand what it felt like to be truly seen. Each time she crossed a line, she built another story to cover it, and every new story needed another one to keep it standing. Ethan was different. He did not build stories. He waited. He watched. An email was forwarded to him by mistake, harmless on the surface, but the attachment was a hotel receipt. 2 names appearing in the same window of time. Coincidence could happen once, not over and over again. He closed the laptop and took a deep breath. Not anger, not jealousy, just the cold clarity of a man who understood the picture was being painted over itself. He thought of Caleb, the friend who once laughed and said, "Science does not lie." Back then, Ethan had called it pessimism. Now it felt like a lifeline. The nursery slowly took shape. Maddie stood in front of the mirror, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes shining. Ethan watched her from behind, seeing both longing and fear locked inside the same body. From above, her heartbeat quickened every time her phone lit up with that familiar name. From above, it was also clear that Ethan quietly rearranged his work schedule, cutting back on long trips, as if being closer might force the truth into the light. That night, Maddie spoke about the future with pleading warmth. She talked about family, about stability, about how everything would be fine. Ethan nodded, his hand resting on her belly, feeling a faint movement beneath his palm. In that moment, he wanted to believe. But deep in his chest, a gear had clicked into a place it could never be removed from. The twist did not arrive with thunder, but with silence. Ethan realized that real power was not in confrontation, but in refusing to be forced into belief. He was underestimated because he never showed off. Yet it was his patience that was tightening an invisible trap. Elsewhere, Grant Holloway continued to smile inside glass-walled meetings, confident that the stories he planted would hold on their own. Maddie stood between 2 shores, trying to balance on the thin wire of her lies, and Ethan, inside a house being prepared for a child, chose to stand still. Sometimes standing still is the most frightening step forward. Grant Holloway walked into the glass conference room with the smile of a man who had never been told no, and the entire room instinctively tilted toward his stride. From an all-knowing view, he was visible long before Ethan ever spoke his name. Grant did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to strike the table. His power lived in the way others adjusted their tone, when facing him, lowered their shoulders to fit beneath the cold glass ceiling. His suit was perfectly tailored. His hair neatly set, his expression gentle enough to make people forget that behind it was a hand tightening invisible strings across an entire machine. Maddie followed him into that afternoon meeting, a folder pressed tightly to her chest. She took her seat back, straight eyes focused like a model employee. But her heart beat faster than usual. From above, that rhythm was unmistakable, quickening every time Grant's gaze passed over her, each glance a dangerous half-beat late. Grant spoke about the project, about vision, about a green future. His voice was low, and even every sentence placed with the precision of a chess move. When he mentioned Maddie, the praise was always measured. Never too much to draw attention, never too little to be forgotten. A form of support that made the person receiving it believe they were rising on their own. Inside Maddie's mind, those words blended with the feeling of being seen, of being recognized. Ethan was not there. Ethan was somewhere between wind and steel. Grant, on the other hand, was right in front of her, solid and present. She told herself it was just work, that everything was under control. Yet every time he stood a little closer than necessary, the space around her seemed to shrink. Ethan was elsewhere. A wind station in the open plains, the air howling like a wild animal. He stood on the metal platform looking at the massive blades turning steady and true. His job was to keep something enormous from drifting out of alignment, and it was there that he understood something clearly. Every system leaves traces when it is being manipulated. That evening, back at the house in Aurora, Ethan opened his laptop. He did not search. He did not dig. He checked only what he was allowed to see. Work calendars, shared emails, project files, and then a small detail surfaced quiet and unannounced. A travel expense approved with unusual speed, a familiar hotel name, a timing that aligned too neatly to ignore. He did not take screenshots. He did not send it to anyone. He stored it away the same way he always did, with hidden faults in a system. He knew that when a wind tower is about to fail, it does not collapse immediately. It vibrates first, it groans first, and only those trained to listen can hear it. Maddie came home late. Grant sent a short message. "Do not worry, everything is fine." She read it and exhaled, as if she had just been granted permission to continue the role she was playing. Ethan saw the message light up on the phone, resting face down. He did not ask. That stage had already passed. From above, it was clear that Maddie was beginning to feel afraid. Not afraid of Ethan, but afraid of losing control of the story she was telling. Afraid of his silent gaze. Afraid of the calm that never reacted. Afraid of standing in front of a man who did not need proof to know he was being lied to. Grant felt no fear at all. He was accustomed to others being afraid, accustomed to watching situations slide neatly into place with nothing more than a vague promise. He did not understand that Ethan did not operate on emotion. Ethan operated on structure, and structure cannot be seduced. One afternoon, Maddie stood inside an elevator, her hand resting on her belly, watching the floor numbers descend slowly. She thought about Grant, about Ethan, about the child. Each choice pulled her in a different direction. From above, the cold sweat at the base of her neck was visible, the exhaustion of someone who had built too many layers to hide behind. At home, Ethan sat in the half-painted nursery. The scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. Warm yellow light filled the room. He placed his hand against the wall, feeling the surface still damp. He thought about what was being built and what was already rotting beneath it, and he made a decision that required no announcement. He would not expose anything yet. He would let everything move toward the point of no return, because he knew true power was not in making someone afraid. It was in knowing exactly when the truth would no longer be denied. Outside, Grant Holloway still believed he was controlling the board. Maddie still believed she could keep her balance. But Ethan, the man most underestimated in this story, had taken the position of the final observer, and from that moment on, every step had already been counted. Labor pains hit just after midnight, violent and without warning, as if Maddie's body had chosen the worst possible moment to force every secret to stand up and be counted. The phone rang through the dark house. Ethan was on his feet almost instantly. Maddie's voice shook, broken between gasps for air. "I'm in pain. It's bad." In that moment, every suspicion, every calculation, every fragment Ethan had quietly assembled over months was pushed aside. He became only a husband, driving his wife to the hospital, cutting through empty streets as streetlights stretched into blurred streaks of white. The hospital was bright and cold, saturated with the sharp scent of disinfectant. Maddie was rushed into the delivery room, the wheels of the gurney rattling across the floor, like metal scraping against nerves. Ethan stayed beside her, gripping her hand, feeling the cold sweat and the uncontrollable trembling. From above, it was clear that Maddie's eyes held more than pain. There was another fear there, deeper, carefully hidden. Marla Jennings arrived quickly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Her coat still carried the scent of perfume, her heels clicked sharply against the floor. She took her daughter's shoulders, speaking soothing words out of habit, but her eyes kept flicking toward Ethan, measuring him. Diane Cole arrived shortly after quieter, carrying a small bag, her movements calm with the composure of someone who had witnessed countless births. She did not intervene. She observed, time fractured into unbearable pieces. Maddie screamed, cried, then bit down hard enough to draw blood. Ethan stood at the head of the bed, both anchor and helpless witness. In each contraction, Maddie called his name, then turned her face away, as if she could not endure his steady gaze. In the middle of one brutal wave of pain, when the nurse briefly turned away, Maddie blurted out in a broken whisper, "He promised I wouldn't have to face this alone." The words slipped free, then vanished into silence. No one asked what she meant, but the air in the room shifted. From above, Marla froze for half a second, then tightened her grip on her daughter, raising her voice to fill the space. Diane lifted her head, her eyes sharpening. Ethan did not move. He did not ask, but in his mind, that sentence was circled, underlined, locked into place. The baby arrived in a cry that tore through the room. A small, fragile body red and shaking in the nurse's hands. Maddie broke into sobs from pain, from relief, from something she could not name. Ethan looked at the child, a surge of tangled emotion rising like an undercurrent. He did not turn away. He did not step forward either. He stood exactly where the truth required him to stand. Marla cried with joy, wiping her eyes, speaking about family and the future. Diane looked at the baby with tenderness, tempered by caution. She had learned that even the most sacred moments could hide the ugliest truth. Eventually the room settled. Maddie lay back against the pillows, exhausted, cradling the baby. Ethan stood by the window, staring into the dark Denver night. Ambulance lights flashed in the distance like an unstable heartbeat. He felt something shift permanently inside him. The hospital administrator entered with a stack of papers, her voice gentle and practiced. "We just need to complete the birth certificate. A signature from the father will do." She placed the form on the table, the pen already set, as if everything had been decided. Maddie looked up at Ethan, searching his face. A thin smile appeared, trying to seem normal. "Can you sign for me? I'm exhausted." In that instant, from above, her heart was racing faster than it had during any contraction. Marla nodded firmly. "Sign it, Ethan. This is when family matters." Diane said nothing. She looked at her son, her gaze neither urging nor stopping him. It was a silent question. "What will you do with the truth you are carrying?" Ethan stepped toward the table. He looked at the paper, at his name already printed, at the pen waiting patiently. And in his mind, Maddie's words echoed again. He promised. The twist was not in the refusal. It was in the realization that he had waited for the right moment. Ethan drew a slow breath, placed his hand on the table, and spoke in a low, steady voice that did not tremble. We wait for the test. The room exploded into silence. Labor pains hit just after midnight, violent and without warning, as if Maddie's body had chosen the worst possible moment to force every secret to stand up and be counted. The phone rang through the dark house. Ethan was on his feet almost instantly. Maddie's voice shook, broken between gasps for air. I'm in pain. It's bad. In that moment, every suspicion, every calculation, every fragment Ethan had quietly assembled over months was pushed aside. He became only a husband driving his wife to the hospital, cutting through empty streets as streetlights stretched into blurred streaks of white. The hospital was bright and cold, saturated with the sharp scent of disinfectant. Maddie was rushed into the delivery room, the wheels of the gurney rattling across the floor, like metal scraping against nerves. Ethan stayed beside her, gripping her hand, feeling the cold sweat and the uncontrollable trembling. From above, it was clear that Maddie's eyes held more than pain. There was another fear there, deeper, carefully hidden. Marla Jennings arrived quickly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Her coat still carried the scent of perfume, her heels clicked sharply against the floor. She took her daughter's shoulders, speaking soothing words out of habit, but her eyes kept flicking toward Ethan, measuring him. Diane Cole arrived shortly after Quieter, carrying a small bag, her movements calm with the composure of someone who had witnessed countless births. She didn't intervene. She observed. Time fractured into unbearable pieces. Maddie screamed, cried, then bit down hard enough to draw blood. Ethan stood at the head of the bed, both anchor and helpless witness. In each contraction, Maddie called his name, then turned her face away, as if she could not endure his steady gaze. In the middle of one brutal wave of pain, when the nurse briefly turned away, Maddie blurted out in a broken whisper, "He promised I wouldn't have to face this alone." The words slipped free, then vanished into silence. No one asked what she meant, but the air in the room shifted. From above, Marla froze for half a second, then tightened her grip on her daughter, raising her voice to fill the space. Diane lifted her head, her eyes sharpening. Ethan did not move. He did not ask, but in his mind, that sentence was circled, underlined, locked into place. The baby arrived in a cry that tore through the room, a small fragile body red and shaking in the nurse's hands. Maddie broke into sobs from pain, from relief, from something she could not name. Ethan looked at the child, a surge of tangled emotion rising like an undercurrent. He did not turn away. He did not step forward either. He stood exactly where the truth required him to stand. Marla cried with joy, wiping her eyes, speaking about family and the future. Diane looked at the baby with tenderness, tempered by caution. She had learned that even the most sacred moments could hide the ugliest truths. Eventually the room settled. Maddie lay back against the pillows, exhausted, cradling the baby. Ethan stood by the window, staring into the dark Denver night. Ambulance lights flashed in the distance, like an unstable heartbeat. He felt something shift permanently inside him. The hospital administrator entered with a stack of papers, her voice gentle and practiced. "We just need to complete the birth certificate. A signature from the father will do." She placed the form on the table, the pen already set, as if everything had been decided. Maddie looked up at Ethan, searching his face. A thin smile appeared, trying to seem normal. "Can you sign for me? I'm exhausted." In that instant from above, her heart was racing faster than it had during any contraction. Marla nodded firmly. "Sign it, Ethan. This is when family matters." Diane said nothing. She looked at her son, her gaze neither urging nor stopping him. It was a silent question. "What will you do with the truth you are carrying?" Ethan stepped toward the table. He looked at the paper, at his name, already printed, at the pen, waiting patiently. And in his mind, Maddie's words echoed again. He promised. The twist was not in the refusal. It was in the realization that he had waited for the right moment. Ethan drew a slow breath, placed his hand on the table, and spoke in a low, steady voice that did not tremble. "We wait for the test." The room exploded into silence. He left the hospital before Dawn had a chance to touch the long, cold glass windows. He did not look back. He made no promises. He carried only a decision forged in silence. The hallway remained brightly lit, but behind Ethan, the delivery room had turned into a battlefield. Maddie screamed, her voice breaking between rage and panic. Marla slammed her hand on the table, demanding he come back, sign the papers immediately, stop humiliating her daughter at a moment like this. Diane stood between the two women, her silence more frightening than any shout. She did not defend. She did not attack. She stared straight at the truth crawling out from beneath every excuse. Ethan stepped into the parking lot, the early wind cutting across his face. Inside his mind, everything slowed down. Not because he was weakening, but because he was choosing every step with care. People underestimated him because he was never loud. Yet that calm was the very power they failed to see. In a temporary apartment on the north side of the city, Ethan sat down, removed his watch, and placed his phone on the table. He did not call Maddie. He did not send a message. He called Nora Vance, the neighbor he had shared coffee with, many times a family lawyer whose voice ran deep and steady. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Are you ready to protect yourself?" The question landed exactly where it needed to. Ethan nodded, even though Nora could not see him. She spoke slowly and clearly, laying out each step. "Separate your accounts. Document every interaction. Sign nothing until the test results arrive. Do not argue emotions. Anchor yourself to facts." Back at the hospital, Maddie sat in the room, holding the baby, tears falling without pause. She called Ethan's name sometimes, pleading, sometimes furious. She spoke about family, about responsibility, about how people were looking at her now. But deep in her chest, the real fear was not losing Ethan. It was losing control of the story she had spent so long building. A message appeared on Ethan's phone as the sky began to lighten. No name, just one sentence. "You are not wrong. Grant has done this before." The sender signed it, Sienna. From above, it was clear how Maddie's hands had once trembled at this name. Sienna was a former co-worker, someone who had transferred departments in silence, someone who had chosen disappearance over challenging power. Ethan read the message once, then again. He did not reply. He did not ask questions. He understood the real meaning lay elsewhere. He was not alone. And the truth had witnesses. He opened his laptop and created a new folder. He did not name it. Inside, he organized everything by timeline. Work schedules, emails, messages, travel expenses, small fragments, emotionless, precise. He worked the way he repaired wind towers in storms. Slow, steady, exact. At the hospital, Marla began to change her tone. She talked about reputation, about relatives, about how a child could not exist without a father's name on paper. Maddie nodded along, clinging to that argument like a final lifeline. Diane listened, then placed a hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. Her voice was low. "Truth does not fear the light. Only lies do." Grant Holloway still knew nothing. He was in a morning meeting, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right times, believing everything remained under his control. He did not understand that some people do not need to shout to bring down an entire structure. They only need to stop signing their names. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the house in Aurora. Not to argue, not to confront. He gathered personal documents, hard drives, a few essential belongings. The nursery still smelled of fresh paint. He stood there a moment longer, resting his hand on the unused crib. For a rare instant, sadness surfaced, not for what was lost, but for realizing that some dreams are built on ground that was never solid. He locked the door. He did not pause. He did not look back. That night, Ethan sat alone under warm yellow light, the city quiet around him. He thought about the child, about Maddie, about Grant. He did not hate. He did not compromise. He chose the hardest path. He chose to wait for science to speak. Somewhere the truth was preparing to step into the light, and when it did, there would be nowhere left for anyone to hide. The next message did not come from Maddie. It came from a man Ethan had never met, and a single sentence was enough to change the color of everything. Ethan read it in the quiet kitchen of his temporary apartment, warm light pooling over the table, where neatly stacked folders lay in order. "My name is Marcus Hale. I think we have the same problem. Grant Holloway." No greeting, no explanation, just an arrow aimed straight at the center. From an all-knowing view, the shift inside Ethan was subtle. Not surprise, not excitement. Just a silent confirmation that what he had sensed all along was not an illusion. When a system fails, it rarely breaks in only one place. They met at a small bar on the edge of the city, where dim light softened faces better than words ever could. Marcus was tall and broad-shouldered hands, rough from years of physical labor. His eyes carried a kind of exhaustion Ethan recognized immediately, the exhaustion of a man who had blamed himself for too long. Marcus did not talk much. He placed his phone on the table and slid it toward Ethan. On the screen were message threads, invitations, half-veiled phrases that felt disturbingly familiar. The same tone, the same tactics, the same name. "I did not know until my wife started changing," Marcus said quietly. "I thought I was losing my mind. Then I heard you refused to sign." Ethan did not react right away. He studied the words not with anger, but with the eye of someone reviewing a technical diagram. Timelines aligned, business trips, late meetings, vague promises. Everything locked into place with chilling precision. Marcus was not the only one. In the days that followed, more names surfaced. Caleb, a mechanic Ethan once knew, called back with a voice no longer joking. A police officer acquaintance of Marcus, a man who spoke little but listened closely. Each brought a fragment of a story, and every fragment pointed to the same source. From above, a network began to form, not fueled by rage, but by patience. They did not gather to seek revenge. They gathered to confirm, to compare, to understand that their past silence had been the armor protecting someone else. Ethan became the center, not because he dominated the room, but because he brought structure. He organized information, untangled narratives, aligned events along a single timeline. When disagreements surfaced, he did not impose. He asked. When emotions flared, he lowered his voice. "We do not need to win. We need to be right." At first, Marcus wanted to storm the company office to shout to force Grant into confrontation. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. His power comes from making others lose control. We will not give him that. They agreed on rules. No threats, no violence, no reckless moves. Only evidence. Only truth. And only when denial was no longer possible. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Maddie felt the walls closing in. She overheard whispers, interrupted phone calls. She noticed Marla growing more tense, her voice dropping. Grant messaged less often. When he did, the words were careful. "Wait. Everything will be fine." But Maddie no longer believed the way she once had. She sensed the coldness of a man realizing too many eyes were turning toward him. Grant Holloway still entered meetings with his familiar confidence, but from above, the cracks were visible. An assistant avoiding eye contact, a colleague pausing too long before responding. Small silences growing heavier each day. Each night Ethan returned to his apartment, opened the unnamed folder, and added more data. He slept little, but he was not exhausted. Some people are fueled by anger. Ethan was fueled by clarity. Late one night, Marcus asked the question everyone else was thinking. If this all comes apart, what do you gain? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought of the child, of Maddie, of the half-painted room. Then he answered, I gain freedom from lies, and so do the others. No one spoke after that, but in the silence, an invisible agreement was sealed. Somewhere Grant Holloway still believed these were harmless whispers. He did not know those whispers were being sorted into files, into timelines, into something that could not be erased. And when the truth arrived, it would not need to shout. It would only need to be opened. The envelope did not knock, but the moment it appeared, the room seemed to lose its air. Ethan received the test results on a gray morning when the city had not fully awakened. The courier did his job, set the envelope down, nodded and left. No explanation, no curious glance. But to Ethan, that thin paper weighed more than any block of steel he had ever lifted on a wind tower. He did not open it right away. From an all-knowing view, his hand rested on the envelope on the kitchen table, beside a cup of coffee gone cold. Early light cut through the window, slicing the room into sharp bands of brightness and shadow, as if the space itself was waiting for judgment. In Ethan's mind, every possibility passed through and vanished. He had prepared for both outcomes, or at least he believed he had. He tore the envelope open. The soft rip sounded too loud in the silence. His eyes moved across the lines familiar neutral clinical. Then they stopped. The probability of biological paternity was 0. Nothing else was needed. The world did not collapse with an explosion. It collapsed into absolute silence. Ethan lowered himself into the chair, not from shock, but because his body chose something solid to hold on to. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with emptiness, as if a room inside him had been cleared out overnight. From above, it was clear there was no victory in that moment. No satisfaction. Only an ending. A door closing for good. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and stood up. The next decision came faster than he expected. No anger, no hesitation. He would face it not to argue, but to end it. Marla's house was quiet when Ethan stepped inside. Maddie sat on the couch, the baby in her arms, her face draining of color when she saw the envelope. Marla rose to her feet, lips pressed tight. Diane was already there, sitting upright, her gaze meeting everyone without flinching. Ethan did not sit. He stood in the center of the room and placed the envelope on the table. No theatrics, no long speech. He opened it and slid the paper toward them. Maddie looked, just for a second. Then she crumpled. No scream, no argument. Only broken breathing and tears spilling like a dam giving way. She clutched the baby tighter, as if letting go would cause the entire world to fall out of her arms. Marla stammered fragmented words about mistakes, about laboratories, about the possibility of error. But her voice weakened as she met Diane's eyes. No anger, no contempt. Just the certainty of someone who had lived long enough to know when there was nothing left to save. Ethan spoke, his voice low and even. The child is not at fault, but neither am I responsible for a lie. Maddie looked up, eyes swollen and red, her voice trembling. I am sorry. I did not know what to do. I was afraid. I was lonely. The late confessions tumbled out, overlapping, desperate and useless. From above, it was clear her heart held not only guilt, but the hollow realization of someone who had traded everything to protect an illusion. Ethan listened. He did not interrupt. When she fell silent, he nodded once. Thank you for telling the truth. But truth does not come to fix things. It comes to end them. Diane stood and placed a hand on her son's shoulder. No advice, no cheap comfort, just steady presence. Marla turned away, her shoulders shaking for the first time without a sentence left to defend her daughter. Ethan took back the envelope and folded it neatly. He looked at Maddie one last time. No hatred, no pity. Just the look of two people who once walked the same path and now stood on opposite sides. He said the final words without raising his voice. "We will handle everything through the law. I will file for divorce." From that point on, things moved quickly. Lawyers, paperwork, signatures, cold lines of text ending a marriage that had once been called a family. Ethan signed his name, each stroke firm. Every signature felt like another nail sealing the past. When he left the lawyer's office, night had fallen. City lights flickered on. Ethan stood alone on the sidewalk and drew in a deep breath of cold air. He did not feel relief. He did not collapse. He felt empty, but it was a clean emptiness. From above, it was clear that some outcomes do not bring sweet justice. They bring only truth. And sometimes truth is the only gift powerful enough to set a person free. Ethan walked on his back, straight his pace, unhurried. The future ahead was uncertain, but behind him, every door had closed. The divorce papers were filed on a dry afternoon, and with a single signature, Ethan severed the last thread still tying him to the past. From an all-knowing view, there was no applause in that moment, no spotlight. Only the waiting room of a law office, the smell of fresh paper, the steady rhythm of a printer like a heart beating without emotion. Ethan sat upright and read every cold line. Assets, obligations, rights and responsibilities. Each sentence reduced people to numbers. Yet that very lack of feeling gave him what he needed most: a boundary. Nora Vance slid the folder toward him, her voice calm. "This is your portion. No entanglement, no obligation, no gray area." Ethan nodded and took the pen. The ink flowed clean and firm. No shaking, no hesitation. People underestimated him because they thought he only climbed wind towers. They did not know he was used to signing decisions that allowed no margin for error. Across the city, Grant Holloway began to feel the ground tilt beneath his feet. No one accused him outright. No one raised a voice. But meetings grew shorter. Emails requiring his approval were quietly rerouted. Replies arrived slower than usual. From above, his confidence chipped away, not by a single blow, but by a series of small scratches. The network Ethan built with Marcus and the others remained quiet. No protests outside company gates, no public accusations. They submitted documents. They sent evidence. They let the truth move through the proper channels. Each email was a brick. Each statement a locking pin. When the structure was tight enough, the door would not need to be pushed. At the hospital, Maddie was discharged to her mother's house. She walked slowly, the baby in her arms, her eyes heavy, as if she had not slept in days. Marla talked more than ever, her words rushed, as if speed could catch up with reality. But reassurance slid off the floor like water on glass. Maddie no longer listened fully. She understood now that vague promises cannot stand when light shines straight through them. Ethan finished clearing what remained in the Aurora house. No arguments, no confrontations. He gathered documents, tools, a few books. The nursery still carried the scent of fresh paint. He stood there for a moment and rested his hand on the wall, now dry. A passing sadness moved through his chest like a draft. It did not knock him down. It only reminded him that he had once believed. He locked the door, returned the keys to the agent's desk, and signed once more. Each signature was a clean cut. It hurt, but it was precise. At the company, Grant was invited into a closed meeting. No shouting, no public charges, only questions. Many questions. Questions he could not answer with his familiar smile. From above, his hand on the table trembled slightly. No one threatened him, but the silence around him had changed its meaning. Marcus called Ethan that evening, his voice lowered. "They are opening a file. Not fast, but solid." Ethan listened and replied simply, "Good. Follow the process. We do not need to rush. That night, Ethan returned to his small apartment and cooked a simple meal. He ate slowly. Outside the window, city lights flickered like a circuit board. He realized the weight in his chest was no longer the same. Not relief, but steadiness. From an all-knowing view, the hardest part was not leaving. It was staying with the decision when the world began to tilt. Ethan managed that not because he was harder than anyone else, but because he chose truth over convenience. Somewhere Grant Holloway tried to keep his balance on a glass floor, already cracking. Maddie learned to hold her child alone in a room without its old laughter. Marcus and the others continued submitting piece after piece, patient as builders, and Ethan, the man most underestimated in this story, went to sleep early. No dreams, no restlessness. He understood that some victories are quiet. They only need to be right, and right in the end always carries its own weight. The news did not break with an explosion. It broke when the whispers stopped all at once. From an all-knowing view, that morning began like any other, then slowed abruptly as internal emails changed their tone. Neutral subject lines, careful wording, an independent review, a temporary suspension. Grant Holloway walked into his office, wearing his familiar smile, but the glass floor beneath him no longer reflected the same way. It was dull, it was cracked, and it made the faintest sound. Ethan did not hear the news from the media. He received a call from Marcus, his voice low but steady. They had enough. Not just stories, not just messages. A full chain of evidence aligned in order. Ethan listened without many questions. When Marcus finished, Ethan said only one thing. Then it is done. For Grant, however, everything was just beginning. The questions became specific. The silences stretched longer. The looks no longer turned away. From above, it was clear he tried to keep his balance using old habits, smooth words, careful deflections. But his power had always depended on other people staying quiet. And that silence had changed hands. Elsewhere, Maddie sat by the window at her mother's house, holding the baby in the late afternoon light. She heard the news through broken conversations through Marla's cautious voice. Inside her chest, the emotions were no longer sharp. They were like warm ash, heavy, and settled. She looked at the child and wondered what she had traded away to protect a promise that was never real. From above, it was clear that for the first time, she was not searching for someone to blame. She simply exhaled, long and slow. Diane came to visit that afternoon. She did not ask about Grant. She asked whether Maddie was eating, whether she was sleeping. Then she looked at the baby and placed a hand gently on the child's back, as one would touch a truth that cannot be denied. "The baby will be fine," she said. Not as reassurance, but as a conclusion shaped by experience. Ethan returned to the wind tower where he had worked for years. The wind blew steady. The blades turned slow and sure. He checked bolts and cables, listened to the familiar vibrations. Here nothing lied. If there was a flaw, it made a sound. If it was stable, it stayed still. From above, a faint smile crossed his face. Not from victory, but from recognition. One evening, Ethan received a short message from an unknown number. "Thank you for not shouting. Because of that, we found the courage to speak." No name. None was needed. He read it, set the phone down, and let it be. Some things do not need a reply to be complete. Grant Holloway left the company on a windy afternoon. No farewell, no celebration, just elevator doors, closing lights dimming. From above, he stood alone in the parking lot for the first time, with no one waiting. Power does not disappear overnight. It dissolves when no one believes in it anymore. Marcus and the others sat together one last time. No celebration. No credit taken. They talked about what came next for their families, for themselves. Ethan did not stay long. He wished them well and left early. Some journeys only need to be shared for a certain distance. Night fell, as Ethan drove along wide roads, yellow lights stretching ahead. He thought about the past months, about the choices laid before him, and the ones he had set aside. From an all-knowing view, there were no violent waves left inside him, only a steady current deep enough that the wind could not cloud it. He pulled over, turned off the engine, and opened the window. Cool air rushed in. In that moment, he understood something simple. Strength is not making others fall. Strength is standing firm when truth passes through. In the distance, the city continued living. Somewhere, a woman learned how to be a mother. Somewhere, a man learned how to face responsibility. And here, Ethan sat quietly, letting silence finish its work. Tomorrow would come. No announcement needed. No proof required. Only what is right. Ethan met Lily on an afternoon that was never planned, when the past thought to be finally asleep was quietly stirred awake by something entirely different. She stood in the backyard of a small gathering of friends, late sunlight slipping through her hair, her laughter soft, unforced, real enough that it did not need to hide behind anything. From an all-knowing view, Ethan paused for a single beat, not from being overwhelmed, but from recognizing a sense of calm, whose shape he had almost forgotten. Lily did not ask about his wounds. She asked if he wanted coffee. They talked slowly. No digging, no exposing. Lily listened with eyes that were not in a hurry. Ethan answered with words that did not need armor. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to explain why he was quiet. From above, it was clear that sometimes the greatest twist is not a dramatic reveal, but the arrival of someone who does not require you to become someone else. Time continued to move forward. No storms, no spectacle. Ethan returned fully to his work, to the wind turbines turning steadily against wide open skies. He rebuilt his life through small things. Meals he cooked himself, early mornings, evenings spent reading as the city slowly softened. Lily appeared in those moments, naturally not taking space, not filling gaps, simply standing beside him. Elsewhere, Maddie continued her life as well. Not easily, not quickly. She learned how to hold her child when exhausted, how to sit in silence when needed, how to accept that some consequences cannot be reversed. From an all-knowing view, she was no longer a woman protecting an image. She was a mother learning day by day. Not perfect, but real. Grant Holloway faded from the stories told out loud. His name was no longer spoken with fear, but with a cool distance that had already settled. His power was not stolen from him. It dissolved because no one supported it anymore. And that was the one outcome he never calculated. One quiet evening, Ethan and Lily sat on a small balcony. The breeze was gentle. City lights stretched below them like misplaced stars. Lily rested her head on his shoulder, asking nothing. Ethan looked out into the distance and spoke slowly. He once believed strength meant holding on tightly. Now he knew strength meant letting go at the right moment. From above, the sharp edge of self-defense inside him was gone. The long-drawn suspicion was gone. What remained was a man who understood his own boundaries. He had been underestimated because of his silence. Yet that very silence was what kept him standing when everything else collapsed. The next day, Ethan returned to the old wind site, the place where he had let the hammer fall into the sea. The water was calm, no trace, no evidence. But he knew that decision had altered the direction of his entire life. From an all-knowing view, some moments leave no image behind, yet they leave behind a different person. This story does not end with applause. It ends with an ordinary morning. Ethan brews coffee. Lily reads the news. Sunlight pours through the window. There is no grand victory, only continuation. And sometimes that is the greatest reward. If you have walked with Ethan to this point, perhaps you have stood before difficult choices, yourself, been misunderstood, been underestimated. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in his place? If this story reached you, press like and follow, so you do not miss future stories about truth choice and the quiet strength of human beings.